Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Womb to Tomb Apologetics, where we teach you how to defend the Christian worldview persuasively. Today, I have another wonderful guest. I have Professor of Rhetoric Brandon Knight here to teach us a little bit about rhetoric and how we can apply the skills of persuasion to apologetics. Thank you for coming on, Brandon.
Of course, glad to be here, William.
So, we've had to debunk an atheist named Brandon on here before. So today I'm happy we have the nice Brandon here to explain some stuff to us.
Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about tell us about yourself and your experience on this issue.
Yes, so I am assistant professor of here at Carey. It's called Strategic Communication and Leadership. I'm actually from the Mississippi area. I went to school for my undergraduate in communication studies at the University of Southern Mississippi. Then went on to to seminary in New Orleans, the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, for a Master's of Divinity, emphasis in biblical studies. I was just to note, I was a youth minister at two different locations here in the state for about 6 years. Just my youth pastor did a lot in my early years of being a young Christian, just to mentor me, and so I wanted to help do that in the lives of other church members. And a year or two out of seminary, I got to questioning whether or not there was more in the academic world for me, and I ended up going back to the University of Southern Mississippi to get a PhD in communication and rhetoric. And my emphasis there is in religious communication. I love, 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 whether it be in scripture or even in contemporary context, looking at discourse, looking at arguments and ideologies, and seeing how they work, seeing how they persuade us, how they move us from point A to point B. And so a lot of my work centers on C.S. Lewis, John Piper. I even recently did one, looked at a homily that the Archbishop of San Francisco, Salvatore Cordileone, did on abortion, and that was in 2022, I believe. And so again, that's what makes me tick, and I love just being a part of this discussion. We even have an apologetics club that I've helped start and sponsor here at William Carey University, and so I see that as my role and my calling here. As to helping students see how communication works at the intersection of the Christian faith, and how it can help us in a whole host of areas, whether it being preaching and homiletics or uh, apologetics, which is why I'm here.
That's awesome. It sounds like you have quite the extensive background with this. Yeah, and you mentioned things like abortion. That's definitely a focus we have on this channel. I mean, obviously we do Christian worldview generally, but I definitely kind of specialize more in that area as
Mm,
well. And I'm really excited. The reason why I'm really excited to have you on here is because on my channel, part of the focus is about exactly what you're about to talk about: rhetoric, persuasion, the types of things that unfortunately a lot of other apologetics channels don't always touch on. They'll tell you an argument for the faith. They'll tell you an argument, against another faith, but they don't really tell us, like, hey, when you're in a conversation, here's how you can uh, directly influence the other person and how you can speak in a way that's going to win people over. Because anybody can recite an argument like a robot, right? But that's not always going to be the way you win someone over. You need to know about word choice. You need to know about, gee, how is this person seeing what I'm doing, and how are they interacting with me in the same way. So
mm.
let's kind of just talk about the basics. What is rhetoric, and why should we use it?
Right. So if you were to ask 10 different people what the meaning of rhetoric is, you'd probably get 10 different responses, most of which, or at least a majority of, would probably be a negative connotation, like saying that someone has flowery rhetoric, or if we watch the media, especially in terms of our presidential elections approaching, anytime rhetoric is used, it's kind of in a negative connotation. But historically, rhetoric was actually, it was a discipline. It was in many ways the founding discipline for the academy. And so, for definition's sake, I would go back to Aristotle, who wrote on rhetoric, and his book on rhetoric was literally talking about equipping citizens, equipping the citizenry, if you will, with wisdom, or technique, if you will, to be able to see how the means of persuasion work in all situations. That's kind of how he defines it. Now, fast forward, of course, from there, you get literally a discipline in the academy. And at the beginning of what we would say university, early on, there were two or three reasons beyond, say, a physician that you would go to university. It was to pursue teaching, right? To be a lawyer, or to be some type of politician beyond a lawyer, right? Uh, but then you get to characters like Augustine in the fourth, fifth, and sixth centuries, and Augustine actually turns rhetoric on its head, whereas he was a teacher of rhetoric, and he used rhetoric as a selfish means to seek glory in front of others, just to show how great an orator he was, right? And he would argue, just like many other greats at that time, that they could persuade you about anything, right? Which is more like sophistry and manipulation than where we get the negative connotations from. But when Augustine finally believed in Christ, he saw that rhetoric should actually be under submission to, uh, God, right? That we have the logos, which is truth, leading us to that capital T truth, as opposed to just trying to persuade us about anything and everything based on the selfish means of someone. And so, in the academy today, when people are looking or studying rhetoric, what we're doing is we're looking at discourse in the world, whether it be religious discourse or secular discourse, and we're getting at, based on theories that are already in existence, as well as creating new theories about how language is working. I mean, I have some friends that look at memes, how they're persuasive. I have some friends that look at media, the media landscape, and how media actually changes us, not just based on the content, but also on the form. For example, Twitter or X, how it has affected our society in a different way than, say, Facebook or MySpace before then. And so, I know that's not an easy, that's a lot, like drinking from a fire hydrant. But if we were to go to Aristotle, he would say developing the skill and the technique to see all the available means of persuasion around. And that's good for two reasons. One, it's good to help you to know that if you're able to see how you're being persuaded, then you are less likely to be manipulated. Okay, less likely to be manipulated, which is very important during the age of politics that we live in today. And then, secondly, uh, the reason that we're here discussing apologetics is that we can actually consider and be discerning and self-reflexive about the language that we use and the arguments that we use in relation to the particular audience that we're speaking to. Why? Because we have a goal. We have a goal to persuade. And you know, as Richard Weaver would say, all language is actually sermonic, because we are ethically attempting to point someone from point A to point B. And so, I think this is right up the alley in relation to apologetics. And as I've said, I've tried to imbue our apologetics club, along with a colleague, uh, the importance of rhetoric. And so we have a lot of students that come over from that club to study communication.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot, but that is so much amazing information there. You talk about even just like that conversion story, which is definitely relevant to, I think, how we ought to approach this subject.
Mm,
Like you said, this is where it kind of gets that negative connotation, because people aren't so afraid of arguments, because usually they can kind of break them down, oh, that has a fallacy here or whatever. But rhetoric is, at least like you say, in modern times, seen as a little bit sleuthy, a little bit
mhm.
slimy. Ooh, that's rhetoric. You're manipulating people, and in a certain
Right.
sense, I mean, you are manipulating people, but it's we're asking ourselves, is this in alignment with truth, or is this in alignment with evil? Because you
Mm,
can, I mean, that's exactly what Satan does, really. I mean, he
Right.
deceives people,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so we need to be vigilant and aware of these sorts of things.
Right.
Um,
Let me push back just a little bit when
sure.
on because I think you're right that it is that it is rhetoric coercion, is it manipulation? And I would disagree that it is manipulation, right? Knowing how we as humans, what makes us tick, and then also just knowing the person that you're speaking to know what their desires are, to know what their background is, and then to speak to them in such a way as to identify with them, and then to show how what you're discussing meets the need that they're longing for. That's not manipulation. Manipulation is literally taking away the agency of someone. You know, decades ago, there were some scholars that would literally call it, you know, they would frame it in terms of love as opposed to sexual coercion or sexual rape is really how some scholars have framed it. And you can even go back to James Madison with the founding of the American or founding of our country, when they talk about religious liberty and the conscience, how the conscience is so important, and for a government to impose a belief on someone, uh, it literally assaults the conscience because it is not a true belief. I would argue that rhetoric and persuasion gets you to true belief, whereas manipulation and coercion gets you to maybe you say you believe it, but you really don't in your heart of hearts. And so I think that's an important distinction, that for example, I think Satan lies to us about what looks like good persuasion and rhetoric, right? We think we're getting to the good, but in fact, we're getting to something much darker and heinous.
Wow, that's excellent. I had never thought about it that way, but see, that's why we have people like you on to help us, think these things through. Because that's exactly right. That's what we want on this channel is thinking through an issue differently. I'd never really thought about it like that. Oh
Mm,
yeah, you could. Rhetoric is meant to be used for good, and so yeah, we're in a certain sense, yeah, we're not really manipulating people. Maybe on a simplistic view of it, sure, but when you really get to understand it, maybe it's not so much like that at all.
Well, I
So
mean,
yeah.
you take conversion, for example, like, even in the incarnation with Christ coming to us, speaking our language, becoming like us, and again, we're not held under a gun to believe. It's, we have that's a part of what we would call common grace in Protestantism, that we get to make the choice to believe, not to be forced to believe. And again, that's the framing that I think is the most ethical view of rhetoric.
That's awesome. All right. So you gave me a short list of concepts that you thought would be most enlightening to explore for people aspiring to persuade or just become apologists. Let's dive into those.
Right.
The first one, we've all heard about this. We've all learned this at least passively somewhere in school. That's ethos, pathos, and logos. Those main three ideas, which I believe come from Aristotle. Is that
Mhm.
right?
That's right.
So give us a little refresher on those, and do you know any? Yeah, just give us the expert explanation of these things, because most of us learned this in when we were very little.
Mm.
Got some, but yeah, let us know what you know on these things.
Right. Well, again, as you say, it goes back to Aristotle, and in particular that text that I mentioned already on rhetoric, where he brings up ethos, logos, and pathos. And these are in many ways what he calls the artistic proofs, meaning that they can be changed and transformed in each setting. Let me start off with just one that is familiar to us, and that would be logos, right? The logic, and from the New Testament standpoint, we also get the word, but the rationale, if you will, like what is the logical case that is being given, say in this sermon or in the apologetic argument, the case that is being made, right? Is it coherent? Are there Does it lack fidelity? In the classic understanding, we have what are called the syllogistic reasoning. So you have A, B, therefore C. Is there some part that doesn't seem to match up that we can call into question? And of course, there's a whole host of questions that we could get into, or cases that we could get into. I know in apologetics, right, the string theory or multiverse theory that comes into play, but the logic of it. And ethos then deals with credibility, or the image of the person that is speaking, or giving the argument. And this is very important because we tend to think, even as you kind of discussed this earlier, but in apologetics, sadly, we tend to only think about logic, right? This is the whole Ben Shapiro, and not saying anything negative about Ben Shapiro, but the whole facts don't care about your feelings, right? Facts don't care about
Right.
your feelings. But it's funny because Ben Shapiro also says that that's only on a broad general public discussion, competitive debate understanding. If his wife comes to him and says something, and then he just spews facts at her, that hurts her feelings. And he literally says, or has said before, that in those contexts, facts should care about your feelings. And so I think it's interesting because we tend to harp on the logical, like just because my syllogism is clean, right? There's nothing missing. Uh, tell me where my sources are wrong. That we forget these other parts, right? And so with ethos, it's not just that you have the credentials. In some cases, it is that you have the credentials, like in Masters of Divinity, or do you have your PhD? We think of Bill Nye the Science Guy, right? Which he has the coat and everything, but come to find out, he has an engineering degree from
Yes.
MIT, right? And so that's a credibility thing. I loved him as a child, but now he's so political, and to know that, I mean, he may still be great at science, but it was kind of a lie the whole time. Is really what it was.
He's
But
Bill
with
Nye the mechanical
engineering guy,
engineering guy.
there you go. But with ethos, I think what's most important is, does the person that you're speaking to actually, not only do they respect you, but do they know that you care about their well-being, right? Uh, or do they see you as an opponent or antagonistic, right? Because credibility is goodwill. Having good credibility is not just having the credentials, but goodwill towards the people that you're speaking to. You know, years ago when Hillary Clinton made her deplorable comment about all those that would not vote for her, even if she had the credentials for a lot of people to respect her, she lost the goodwill credibility there. Maybe she lost it before. I'm not sure, but it's funny because Aristotle actually says logos isn't even the most powerful of the three. It's definitely important. Your logic has to be, if there's a triangle, then the logos is at the top. But he
Right.
actually says that ethos is the what is it? He says he calls it the controlling factor. The controlling factor. So your logic can be on point. You can be the way that you share the gospel could be the clearest, most creative, persuasive thing ever. But if they don't trust you as a person, or they see you as being antagonistic, then the persuasion is going to be lost there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what we see when, you mean, like you said, you can give the most persuasive case, but if they think you're trying to pull one over on them, they
Hmm.
think there's something going on. You're trying to trick me. You are my enemy. This is all a scam,
Hmm.
right? They're not going to trust what you have to say. And I noticed, I've taken like negotiation classes before, and
Mm.
it's fascinating how they don't usually uh, label the participants as opponents.
Mm.
They label them as counterparts, which is
Mm.
very interesting. And it's a small change, but that filters the way that you go into the conversation, right? If you're opponents, well, then it's a zero sum game, which is a form of negotiation tactic. You can approach
Right.
it that way, the distributive mindset. That is good, but most of the experts that I've heard from generally tend to say you actually should go the opposite way. You should try to be collaborative, not
Yep.
distributive.
Mm.
And that is going to not only help you win in the short term, but it's actually going to help you win in the long term. Because when people figure out that you're nasty, when people figure out that uh, you're just there to squeeze every drop out of them of whatever the resource is, then they're not going to collaborate with you in the future, and you're going to
Right.
get a bad reputation. And I know I've struggled with this too. We've all been there where, we think we're going in and, oh, I made a great logical case, but we're angry or we're mean, and sometimes we don't even notice it, but like we
Mm,
need to gain that awareness and say, okay, well, maybe I need to cool off. Maybe I need to figure out how to rewire this. Because, like you said, you can be as logical as you want, but people need to trust you. People need to feel like you care about them.
mm.
And you're going to, yeah, hopefully that'll help you succeed. Tell us about the last one, or yeah, if you have
Yeah,
another.
well, just one thing. So with negotiation, you're probably familiar with game theory, right? Thinking of your plays and thinking about the what play will be made by your opponent afterward. I think that's how apologetics tends to be made, right? Or framed. And
Mm,
I've taken apologetics and philosophy of religion classes, both, or at least philosophy of religion from a public institution, and then taken it from a seminary. So I've kind of gotten most of both worlds, but the understanding is, oh, well, when you say this, they're going to say this, and then you respond with this, right? And the understanding is that if you can just take them through that whole selection, then they'll be persuaded. And again, that's only focusing on logos. It's not
right.
focusing
It's like a
on
chess match,
right.
and that's not
Yes, the
exactly how
ultimate
it
game
goes.
theory, right? And so this gets us. So again, ethos is the controlling factor. So you might have a logical argument, but be seen as a salesman or someone, or they honestly just don't know who you are, because we are kind of defensive around people that we don't know. And the sad part is that for Christians, it's easier to have conversations with people we don't know than with people that we're close to, especially on these matters. And so just know that that already sets us up in a unique place in terms of ethos, where people are already going to be defensive about it. And that gets us to pathos, which is the emotional side, right? And just know in our world, we tend to think of emotions as, you know, being heavily negative connotation. I think even the Shapiro reference of facts don't care about your feelings. The feelings would be relegated to the emotions. But note that emotions are a part of it, right? And you can motivate uh, through a whole host of emotions. That if you go back to Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, or where he won and became president in 2008, if you remember the image, and actually this is used in a lot of visual rhetoric studies from that time, but it was just hope, right? And hope is an
Yeah.
emotion, right? And the picture of Obama too was him looking off into the distance, right? Um, and hope is something that we can all get on board about, right? And yeah, we disagree about a lot of things, but we all have a hope, a good hope for the future, not just for ourselves, but for our families and for our grandkids. But know too that emotions can be manipulated very easily, in the sense of a fear, of of you know causing anxiety, and so it's important. Now let me give you this, because this is part of some of my research too. Because Christians, we bought into this kind of enlightenment idea that the logic is above all, that reason is above all, and that the emotions only manipulate our logic, and we need to get away from that. Well, I disagree with that. I believe that in the image, that the true image of God, that we were created in, that He created us, that He created reason, but He also created us physiologically with emotions. And Jonathan Edwards actually wrote a lot about this, about the role that reason and logic play with the emotions. And he gives the metaphor of heat and light. He says that you can't have light without heat, and the understanding is that when you truly do get to truth based off reason, that it actually does, your emotions are caught up in it, right? That you experience joy, for example, when you understand the gospel for the first time, or when you're reminded of the gospel and you worship from it. That's true organic joy. Now, that's not to say that it can't be manipulated, but that the full functioning of the emotions and the and logic should go together, not be put at odds with one another. But of course, in persuasion, I can point to many of attempts of going to, down here in the South, with youth ministries, churches would put on the heaven's gates, hell's flames, things like that. And although the intention, I don't think, was to manipulate anybody, it was this heavy, heavy emphasis on freak these kids out, right? With scenes of hell and the rapture and so on and so forth. Um, and a lot of people you find do feel manipulated from that. And so there's something to be said. So you have ethos, you have logos, and you have pathos. All three can work in tandem together. But let me just say again, even Aristotle said that ethos is the controlling factor. So your logos can be great. You can even be pushing people to the right uh, emotions and motivations, whether through joy or hope. But it's not going to fully persuade if the ethos is, you know, not trusted. So there's something to be said about that.
Yeah. And, I see even with the emotion aspect of things, you see this in the abortion debate with people who, even among pro-lifers, who debate over, well, should we show pictures of the aborted or should
Mm,
we not, right? And one says, well, this is like really emotionally compelling. We need to show people the truth. This is
mm,
ugly, but the reason why people are reacting so negatively is because they feel ashamed. That's why, and so
right. Mm,
they know what's really going on, and then they have the other side who says, well, this is just stirring up anger, and then we lose credibility because people start attacking us and calling us, you're just here to inflame people. You're not here to have a discussion. So
mm. I
yeah, so you
forget what the
definitely see that.
statistic is for crisis pregnancy centers that have ultrasounds. For a mother
Yeah.
that has an ultrasound, it's pretty high percentage that they do not get an
Yeah.
abortion after seeing that ultrasound. So again, that's logic and a visual,
Yeah.
emotion. And I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean, it's
I'm pro life, but I remember unexpectedly walking upon a protest, and some of those images were there, and let me just say it was jarring. I was not ready for it,
mm,
but I think that's part of what that is, as you said, what that is supposed to do. But people who do it just need to know that if you're going to jar people, um, what else are you going to have there to kind of help buffer rattling the emotions of someone, right?
yeah, that's a good point. Not to stay on this topic a little too long, but I mean, there is a good saying from the organization Justice for All. I forgot who uh, works there as the head, but he calls it opening the casket on
Mm.
abortion, which is a reference to the Emmett Till
Oh
pictures,
yeah,
which
yep,
of course were very famous.
yep.
Uh,
In Mississippi,
definitely,
actually. Mhm.
yeah, exactly. And so that's definitely been used before, and obviously people still debate about it. But
Mm.
let's move on to the next two, which are the ones you don't really learn about in school, and those are Kairos and Mythos. What the heck are these, Brandon?
Right. Yeah, so definitely not specifically from Aristotle's on rhetoric, but Kairos has been just a classic theme, and understanding both in Greek and Roman religions. But Kairos is this divine time. So, in normal type of understanding of time is where we get chronos, right? So if you have a cheap watch, it may be chronos, right?
Yeah.
But Kairos is that divine time, right? That divine appointment. And this is rhetorically, this is used in a lot of crisis situations, right? But even in the New Testament, that we get reference to this understanding of Kairos, that at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. right? At just the right time. Um, or, for example, the name is getting away from me, but different biblical characters that literally they were born and brought up specifically for this calling, right? That Kairos, that God appointed time. And so there's something to be said about that. For example, in I'm Southern Baptist, and in growing up in Baptist churches, we have our invitation time, right? And I actually got saved at a revival in the year 2000. I thought I was a Christian, but only understood Christianity culturally. But at the end, the evangelist was speaking, and this wasn't the normal pastor of the church, but he was speaking at the revival and gave his whole life story and talked about how he believed in Christ and how it changed him, and what ultimately Christ's death meant and his resurrection. And then he gave an altar call, right? The invitation, if you will. And what do they say? He's like, this is your time, right? This is the time that you've been given. And honestly, it was a blessing at that time because it challenged me. And I mean, there was no way that I was going to get away from that church that night without speaking to someone about actually believing and giving my life to Christ. And so that's that kind of divine appointed moment.
Yeah. And
And oh, go ahead.
could
Go ahead.
this uh could this be related at all to what we see in advertising where they say call now, there's only so many left and this
Oh,
is,
yeah.
in the
On
next hour.
sale, right? Yep.
Yes.
Yep. So the sale ends, or you have 20 hours to call, and then it's got a little clock
Yes.
showing the seconds ticking away, or we have only so many left in stock. Those
Right.
are very important, uh, or very highly used persuasive tactics used in marketing. But note too that uh, again, I don't think intentionally trying to be manipulative, but that's kind of what we hear in some sermons too, right? That
Yeah.
you don't know if you'll make it home after
Right.
church, which is true. That is true. There's always a
Right.
probability, but is that the only type of persuasion that we're giving to people to believe in Christ, right? As opposed to
Yeah.
just, but we do need to be reminded that every day is a gift, right?
Yeah.
And so there is some truth, there is a logic to that, but oftentimes I think we stop short of that just with the almost kind of scare tactic with it.
Yeah, I see that a lot in um, Ray Comfort's
Mhm.
Apologetics. He'll do the video and he, I mean, he's pretty successful, but I sometimes worry a little bit on how he pressures people
Mm,
sometimes. And it's not that it's necessarily wrong, but I don't think it's maybe always as effective. But he does
mm,
do that. When the person says no, he'll say, no, oh man, I gotta, if you were about to jump out of an airplane without a parachute, would you do that? No, I wouldn't. Well, that's what it's like to go to hell or something. I
mm,
forgot the exact lines
mm,
that he uses, but he's like, I gotta, you know, let you out of the airplane by your legs a little bit and give you a little taste of what's going on. That's what it's going to be like if you don't do it. And, sometimes they'll get a yes, but I wonder sometimes, is that a commitment? Yes.
mm.
And again,
That's an important thing. Yeah, that's
we
very
talk
important.
about in negotiation. Chris Voss talks about this in Never Split the Difference. He talks about how yes is not always the most effective thing to get people to. Sometimes what you really want is a no, because
Mm,
no signals commitment. It
yep.
means, oh my gosh, what am I getting myself into? When you say no, it's a very safe word. People are just very relaxed. Oh no, oh I don't want that. Do you,
Mm.
So another interesting thing. Maybe I'll talk about that on another episode. But just some fascinating things.
It's also
Did you have
just
anything?
honesty, right? You want the
Yeah.
person to be honest, and as a youth pastor, and my oldest is 11, and she's been asking more questions. She was asking about baptism. We went to a baptism class, but I want her to truly believe in Christ on the merits, and it be her faith and not something that we pushed her into, only to 8 years from now her walk down the aisle again and say that she was never a Christian because she had been pushed into it, right? That those things kind of scare me, especially having worked in youth ministry, because people are confused. about whether or not they made their own decision, and
Yeah.
I want people to make their own decision.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like what they say about what you win people with is what you win people to.
Right. Yep. And if you scare
So
people into it, you can scare them out of it, is
right.
what I've also heard.
So unless you have anything more on Kairos, why don't we talk about Mythos?
Yeah,
What's that all about?
mythos. Yeah, mythos is kind of this understanding of the importance of narrative, or just the overarching story. Our day and age, what we might call postmodernity or post-postmodernity, I don't even know anymore, is kind of antagonistic towards meta narratives, kind of meta narratives that tell a story of, here's good, here's evil. But just know that every society, every nation, every culture, every religion has a mythos at work, right? Even sub regions have mythos at work, right? Stories that we tell ourselves to know who we are, right? And then who is against us, who is for us. And so, just to give you a broad understanding for, primarily Christian listeners, there is a Christian mythos, right? The understanding that God created us and He created it and it was good, and then we were manipulated and deceived by Satan, and things that were very good went very bad. And then the rest of Scripture is pretty much God trying to uh, get us back into relationship with Him, and the greatest way that He did that was through His Son, who came at just the right time, right? And fulfilled all the things that we could not fulfill on our own. And then ultimately He died. And then the biggest thing of all is that He resurrected, and in resurrecting, He defeated death. All of these things that we could not do on our own, being perfect, sinless before the law, um, defeating death, who is its own story and mythos made up in all cultures that kind of holds us in bondage. But we have the story in which death has been defeated, right? That you don't need necessarily yeah, it's the Avengers, right? That kills um, Thanos, right? Thanos is actually Greek for death. Um, but
Oh, cool.
but Jesus literally dies, uh, and comes back to life to defeat him. And that is our story, right? That's our story, that if we believe in Him, we're literally adopted into His family. We're co-heirs with Christ, and that we have this great commission, that we have a message, a persuasive message, not just a message, but a persuasive message that appeals to the hearts and the minds of people all over
Yeah.
the world. And that's ultimately what the New Testament gives us. That's our
Yeah.
Christian mythos.
And and so what you're saying then is kind of we can invite people into a part of this story. You're not part of this story yet. I mean, not
Right.
at least not knowingly, you're not part of this story. And you can be someone key in all of this. You
Mm,
have a place and a purpose in life, which is interesting because we don't often, I mean, again, we don't hear about mythos in school, but that's actually really important. People
mhm,
want to know where their place is in the world, and they want to be part of a story. They want to have meaning.
mm.
And I think maybe that's what mythos gives us.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
like
very
how
interesting.
you framed it, that we're invited in, and that really is it. But note that just because people don't believe in the Christian mythos doesn't mean that they are not a part of a mythos, which means that
Right.
they see themselves in a particular story. I mean, some people see secularism as the highest good, humanism, right, as the highest good, which is to see all things through reason and rationality and nothing else. There is no supernature. And in fact, like American Humanist Association, they have three manifestos, and the progression of their manifestos literally uh, continually just to gets rid of religion, and actually sees religion as opponents to the greatest good, um, which means that then kind of centers who you are as a good person, is to not being religious, and actually being antagonistic towards religion in unique ways. And so we're all a part of different stories, right? Mythos or mythoi, if you
Mm.
will. But the question is, um, which one which one is the true story?
Yeah, and so does it sound like then what we ought to be doing as apologists is not just building up our own mythos and inviting people into it, but also making attacks on the mythos of other people and saying, "Hey, here's why the story you're claiming to be a part of doesn't really make a lot of sense, or why it's actually harmful or something like that."
Yeah, I mean, I think, even biblically, right? This is Paul in Athens. Like he does a little audience analysis as he gets into Athens. He looks around, he sees all the idols. He was familiar with the idols already, but then he sees the idol to the unknown God, which kind of gives up the game, right? Like that they're just willing to worship all these things, hoping that they get it right. And then Paul says, I know you guys are searching, but you're even worshiping this unknown God. So let me tell you the true God, which is this one that is unknown to you, right? And I think that's you see missiologists doing this very well. If your audience wants to look at some work by Don Carson or Don Richardson, he has a book called Eternity in Our Hearts, which actually tells I'm pretty sure that's the book, tells the origin story of where the Athenians got the idol, the idol set up to the unknown God, um, and how. And C.S. Lewis makes this argument too that you know that really all religions are attempting to get at that, to reach the divine, right? To reach to that capital T truth, but in many ways have set it up to where it's impossible. And even Judaism, in essence, from our standpoint, is impossible. But that's why we have the greatest miracle, which is the incarnation. You don't even get the resurrection unless you have the incarnation, where God becomes man. So instead of challenging people to be perfect, men being God, we have a God that was gracious enough to humble himself, learn our language, and then even through stories, right? Parables. That's another mythos right there that stokes the imagination, telling us who we are, who God is, so on and so forth. But yeah, I think even Old Testament, you see a lot of polemics done against the case G gods and the ideologies that are there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and people have commented on even just Genesis, the very beginning, the creation narrative, even that itself being a polemic against the other Near Eastern gods.
Yeah.
Oh, you have your moon god.
Mm.
Oh, you have your sun god. Well, guess what? My god, those aren't gods, or if they are,
Created
they're
them.
lesser gods. They're created.
Hmm.
Our God is the one true God. Yours are, you know, phony or fake or less than. Ours is way more powerful, way better. And he created everything.
Mm.
So take that, you
Mm.
know. So interesting stuff. Why don't we move on then to the next concept, which is social judgment theory? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so social judgment theory, I think, is just most helpful. You'll see this in a lot of public speaking textbooks as you get to kind of the persuasion session, because we have an informative assignment and then we get to a persuasive assignment. But social judgment theory is ultimately, I think, most useful to help students realize that persuasion is not a one-time event. It's not a one-time event. And to realize that you have to understand that your audience is very different from one person to the next. Or if you're speaking to a large crowd, you're going to have a very different audience. This is a critique of a lot of the classic speakers, even Plato, in terms of philosophy, that he saw the audience as kind of uniform, or the classics saw the audience as being very uniform. That if he's speaking to the Athenians, well, they're all Athenians, so they all think the same. Well, if we can see anything in the 21st century, that's definitely not the case. All Americans do not think the same. Even all Southern Americans do not think the same, so on and so forth. But social judgment theory is pretty much when you give an idea or a claim about something, it's the recognition that your audience member is going to be in one of three locations. Okay, one of three locations, and it's literally like a spectrum. So if I were to say, that, uh, knowing just your audience, right, that abortion is a sin. Abortion is against God, right? That's a claim. Okay. Well, you might have someone listening that agrees with you. And that's where on this spectrum, right, we call this the latitude of acceptance. The latitude of acceptance. Okay. Meaning that they agree with you there. Okay. But when you say that, you might also have someone else in the audience that is not their latitude of acceptance, right? That they're not willing to see abortion as a negative. They're actually seeing it as a freedom. And this is what is called the latitude of rejection. The latitude of rejection. So anything seen against abortion in a negative light is something that you outright reject. Now, this is important to know because if you know that your audience is immediately going to reject something, then maybe that's not exactly where you need to start. Okay. And so
Yeah.
and this is apologetics, and I tell my classes this too. So if you know that the person you're speaking to is an atheist, okay, and actually doesn't have much understanding or even background in religious education, Christian education, none of it, okay, and all that you know about them is that they don't believe in a God, okay, you're and they reject that, right? That's the part of their latitude of rejection. Well, a good place for you not to start is, well, let me tell you about Jesus the Christ, the Jewish Messiah who came in the first century. Okay.
Right. That's gibberish to them.
Yeah. And so, but we sometimes do that, and we overlook where they are, and we've missed that Kairos, that opportunity to kind of start where they are. Now, sometimes if this is a person that you don't know, you need to ask a question, right? And questions
Yes.
are very important because they are revealing in that. Well, tell me what your thoughts are about, why don't you believe in God, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
maybe
and
oh, go ahead.
let me even, this is so interesting because all of your ideas are connecting now. This
Hmm.
is really good. So you're talking about asking questions. This is something that Greg Kokel, another
Yep.
apologist, talks
Yep.
about. Um, and while you're asking questions, you're not just gaining information. You're also gaining credibility, which we just talked about, right?
Yep.
Because this person now sees, oh, this person isn't here to just preach to me and talk at me. They actually want to learn something about me.
Mm.
They actually care about me. And so you're learning a little bit about their mythos. You're learning how to gain
Logos
credibility.
or
You're
logos too.
exactly logos. You're just seating the person in a perfect spot. And something that Greg Kokel talks about is sometimes we are so obsessed with the gathering part. He talks about using a biblical analogy. Jesus says, there's the sowers and the reapers, right? People are so busy reaping. They want to, let me get to the end. I got to get
Mm.
this person before the conversation ends to the foot of the cross. They got to be crying, oh my gosh, I'm going to give my life
Hmm.
to Jesus. And yeah, that's great. And that works in a movie wonderfully. But most people are not going to get to that point in, a 3-minute conversation in the grocery aisle,
Mm.
right? Instead, you are planting seeds. You're not necessarily a reaper, you're a sower. And that doesn't mean that you can't reap, but as he says, when we sow correctly and when we do gardening, what he calls gardening, the fruit becomes so ripe it just falls into the basket. When
Hmm.
they're ready to go. And so I think that while I understand we want to be confident and we want to play on our playing field, sometimes you see these people like Jeff Durbin, for example, who I think he's a great apologist. I think he does really good work. Sometimes he goes a little far into just slamming Jesus right into the conversation from the get-go.
Hmm.
And he goes really hard into attacking the other side's mythos, but it's a little bit without gaining the credibility. The person doesn't feel necessarily as loved. They don't feel like they are being listened to sometimes,
Mm.
and it's just not as helpful. And so that's a really fascinating concept, and it shows. I love that how you've explained everything, because it all is starting to connect. You're seeing all these concepts meeting each other in this really comprehensive worldview.
The the I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The um, specifically with the relationship, the unique thing about that, or at least asking questions, and Socrates was known for asking questions, and the whole thing was is that he was actually trying to show for all the people around him that those that boasted about knowing a bunch of things, that he would just ask them a question until they would realize that they didn't know anything. Right? That true wisdom is knowing that you don't know anything. Right? That's the interesting thing. But what if this person responded? If you were to say, "Well, what do why do you, what are your thoughts about God? Why haven't you believed?" Right? There's so many Christians around. We're here in the Bible Belt, or at least that's my context. Why have you chosen not to believe? And I mean, for example, one response, which would give us a unique place to start, would be, "Well, I believe that the universe has always been here. I believe the universe has always been here." It's like,
Mm.
really, really. And we'll have, what research, or where did you get this idea from? And if they were being honest, then they'd probably say it's just a belief. It's like, well, can I share a little bit of information with you, because I've also done some research on this as well, right? That this is actually a classical belief that the universe has always uh, existed, but in recent centuries and decades, especially since the Enlightenment, we've come to discover what we know as the Big Bang Theory, right? And the Big Bang Theory helps us to see that the universe has not always existed. In fact, there was a very important point, right, that they define in Latin as ex nihilo, which means from out of nothing, which means from out of there was no matter that existed prior to it, which
Right.
means that this what they call the singularity happened, and then all of a sudden, and even to this day, the universe is still expanding, right? And physicists, have researched this, and it's definitely more validated than the belief that the universe has always is eternal, right? And so, what do you think about that? Have you thought about the Big Bang Theory? And notice that what that conversation would be doing is literally just helping them get to a point, guiding them to a point, and not using knowledge, as Paul would say, right, to puff up oneself, to be prideful, because really in arguments, that's what it's all about. We want to win the argument as opposed to helping someone get to faith. And that's
Win
a
the person, not
yeah,
the argument.
yeah,
Yeah.
what is it? Knowledge puffs up, but love builds
Love
up, right?
builds up. There we
Yeah.
go.
And so uh, because once you get to that Big Bang Theory, there's a huge question there, right? There's a huge question there. Why? How did something come from nothing, right? And have we ever seen something come from nothing before, right? That's the causal effect. And then they will, by that point, which hopefully is probably a 25-30 minute conversation where you're truly listening to the other person, and they're willing to listen to you, and you say, well, honestly, this helps me believe all the more the Genesis story, which says that God is eternal, but God is not matter, and that when he created all things, that he created matter, and that what we see scientifically or understand, and we really don't fully understand, right? The Big Bang Theory, something from nothing, is when God spoke. Um, Now, am I 100% certain on that? No, but I am persuaded by that information, right? I'm persuaded by that information, that even classical understanding was that the universe was eternal, but then science gets us to saying that's not true. there's actually a point of creation starting to exist, creation starting in terms of the universe, right? And that looks like Genesis to me. Have you heard of that before? What do you think about that? Do you think that's not the same? So on and so forth.
Wow, that was excellent. That was a uh, fantastic explanation of that. Do you have anything more on social judgment theory, or we can move on to the next topic as well?
There are more components. I mean, sometimes, and this will be very brief. There's literally a latitude of non-commitment, right? Or and that's where you're talking about something that literally the person has no idea about whatsoever, right? They've never come into contact with it. Like, what do you think about the atonement? And
Uh,
they're not religious at all. We need to be very just mindful, right? Why are we trying to have conversations to get people to believe, or evolution for that matter, right? If why start at
yeah.
evolution when someone says they don't believe in God at all, right? Why does why does the conversation have to start there? And maybe it's more dramatic. Maybe that's what people want because they see it as dramatic, but I don't think it's helpful.
Yeah, yeah, that's an important point, and in talking about how we break down barriers and not always bringing up things that would be a little less than helpful, we'll call it.
Mm,
That's you talked about the atonement, right?
mm.
That's what Greg Koukl would call speaking Christianese.
Yep, Christianese. Yep,
Atonement. I don't even know what
yep.
that word means, let alone what you mean by it.
Propitiation.
Yeah, exactly. So okay, let's talk a little bit about this other thing. You talked about this man, Kenneth Burke, you mentioned
Right,
to me, and this idea of identification and consubstantiality. Talk about speaking another language.
right. Yeah.
Translate this to us, Brandon.
Well, hopefully it will become clear. But so Kenneth Burke, early 20th century, was a literary critic. He was a brilliant, brilliant guy. He never actually graduated from college, if my memory serves me correct. He was a Luddite, which meant that he went without electricity. He was kind of a bohemian type of guy in his life, but he was a literary critic. He loved literature, the classics, if you will. But at a certain point in his life and his publications, he wanted to go beyond that because he saw that persuasion was at work in literature, but it was a much broader phenomenon than in rhetoric, as he ultimately will get to. And so he is interesting character because he gets us from literary criticism, looking at the classic literature, to looking at all of language. And this is funny because if you ask someone if they study rhetoric, well, you need to know: are you an English rhetorician or a rhetorical critic, or are you a communication rhetorical critic? Now, early 20th century, they were both together, but we are no longer together. Because it's all about what we study, and whereas in communication it's much broader. We can look at literature, but most of us look at pop culture, speeches, documentaries, movies, um, biblical texts, so on, sacred texts, so on and so forth. But Kenneth Burke moved from literary criticism to rhetorical criticism. He has books, a number of books, A Grammar of Motives. He even has a book called The Rhetoric of Religion. Just know he is very difficult to read. I felt a little comfort in that when one of my PhD advisors told me that after I had tried to read A Rhetoric of Religion. But he said he calls it a study in logology, right? That that all of language in many ways you can pick up on motives within our language, right? That we use a word for a specific reason, and if we analyze it, then we can get down to those meanings. Interestingly enough, Kenneth Burke analyzed rhetoric, the rhetoric of Hitler while Hitler was still in power, which was a bold move at that time. And he
Yeah,
ultimately sees Hitler and his rhetoric as kind of this religious medicine man for the Aryan race, right? For the Germans. But the problem is that he was, he's obviously sowing hatred, so on and so forth. But he just saw this importance to the looking at motives within language and how it works, and even in particular how religious language works. A lot of people will say religion should be looked at in a bad way because it has only brought about negative things. Look at all the wars. Um, they've been mostly fought over because of religion, which I don't agree with.
Yeah,
I
that's
think,
not true.
yeah, land seems to be a big one, and we all like land beneath our feet, but also money. But he would go so far as to say that it's the sacred things in life that can literally be used in the worst kind of ways, and so that's the I think a big takeaway, that it hurts us on the inside to see the sacred things used in abusive and horrible ways against especially other people. But Kenneth Burke ultimately says this about persuasion, that persuasion should no longer be called persuasion. It should be called identification. Identification. And so he says, in the context, whatever context it is, how are you, the rhetor, seeking to identify with the audience or the listener, right? And he even gave a few ways to do this. He's like, if you really want to become one, right, identify with somebody, you'll speak their language. You'll even speak their intonation, right? That if you're an Athenian, you don't want to go before a Laodicean crowd and speak as an Athenian. You want to become more like Laodiceans, which makes me think of Paul, where he becomes all things to all people, right? Why is the New Testament written in Greek as opposed to Aramaic? Why? Because it was accommodating. They were trying to accommodate to everyone in the empire, to identify that Jesus the Christ was not just for this one ethnic group, but for all. Um, and so identification. And so let's think about this, right? So even in apologetics discussions, how are we seeking to identify with the person that we're speaking to, right? Asking questions. I tell my students that one way that we see identification at work is when we introduce ourselves to someone for the first time, right? There's actually a lot research that shows, right? There's a lot of anxiety when we go to meet someone for the first time. This is oftentimes, uh, if you're bad like me, you can't remember what someone's name is, right? Because you're just overthinking everything, right? But what do we do in order to get closer to the person that we're meeting with, right? Well, first we shake hands. That's a cultural custom here. So already there's a physical touch that's involved, right? We say,
Yeah.
"Well, what's your name?" "My name's Brandon Knight." Uh, and then my question always is, "Where are you from?" Right? "Where are you from?" And they'll say, "Oh, I'm from, this county in Mississippi." And it's like, "Oh, I've been there before. I actually have a good friend that I graduated college from or college with who grew up there. He says a lot of great things." Now, why would I do that? Well, one, because I'm trying to get closer to this person because it's kind of antagonistic to be speaking to someone that you don't know anything about. But all of our language and communication is to get us closer together, right? To identify with one another. And that's actually
Right.
how friendships start, right? And it's so funny because we never really know when the threshold begins for a friendship, right? We know when we're mere acquaintances, and then we're friends, man. We're close, right? You're my BFF, as my 11-year-old would say. But and then we also know when that friendship ends, right? When we've alienated. And so notice that it's no longer persuasion, it's about identification and alienation. What are you doing to get closer to the person that you're trying to persuade? And are you being wary that you're not alienating them, right? Which means that you're pushing them further away as opposed to getting closer. Now, music does this. Movies do this. There's certain characters that we see that we like what they're doing, so we grow closer to them. I mean, there's literally shows where we study parasocial relationships because people feel like they're invested in the character development of someone. Um, that's persuasion, right? And then there's those characters in movies, for example, they do something hideous that we would not expect them to do. They do something evil, a vice, and what happens? I hate that character. Ever since they did that, I hate that character. Um, well, identification and alienation. How is it working in our conversations? How is it working in our preaching? How is it working in our daily friendships with these people? Because hopefully we do have friendships with these people. We're not just trying to be apologists to them, right? Um, and then the big thing is look at the how God sought to identify even in the midst of our alienation. Where did alienation happen? It happened at Genesis, right? Literally, we're removed from the garden, we're exiled, but God still continued to speak, right? He spoke through Moses, he spoke through the prophets, he spoke through the law, and then ultimately, as I tell students, he spoke the loudest through his son, and he's still speaking through the church today. That's identification. God's trying to literally become like us so that we can become like him, right? That we can be
Yeah.
born again in him. And that even that language in him, right? In Christ, that's consubstantiality. That's identification is just a different fancy word that Burke uses. Consubstantiality, one substance, one substance. Instead of two substances, right? We're together. We're one substance. That's how close we are. And ultimately that's what persuasion can get to us. That's what salvation ultimately is, where the Holy Spirit's given to us, and we are adopted, and we are in Christ, uh, where He is already seated, next to the Father, as Paul would say. And so that hopefully that wasn't too much on that, but it's a big concept. It kind of reveals quite a bit, and you know whether it be the movies that Christians are making or the language that we're using from the pulpit or in apologetics as a whole, are we seeking to identify with the people that we're speaking with, or are we just trying to get them further and further away? And that's alienation.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you for the explanation. Let's move on then to one of our final concepts, which you call Monroe's motivated sequence.
Hmm.
What is this, and where do we see this? Why is this important?
Yes. So Monroe's motivated sequence. Alan Monroe was a psychologist. I believe it was going to be. It's the 40s, uh, 50s, because this would have been World War II and after. But he was looking at how advertisements and marketing and even political images can motivate, right? Um, Usually during wartime, we call this propaganda. Uh, Propaganda, though, tends to be not very strategic and simplistic in its persuasion. But Alan Monroe looked at a series of steps that needed to occur in order to move someone from point A to point B. Okay. And the way this begins, he would say, is it starts with a problem that you have to help the person you're listening to realize that there is a problem, a need, if you will, right? And in psychology, we talk about this understanding of dissonance, right? That uh, that you don't have the answer for this, right? Or you are not fully complete without this. And we see this in a lot of advertisements and marketing. We were talking a little earlier, Woom, about the Snuggie, right? That's the old school commercial. I make joke of it because we own one. My wife uses it on a daily basis. But the Snuggie commercial, for example, begins giving us an image of a consumer, right, in her home who's watching TV, and she's cold, so she's got a cover, right? But then she needs to get up and make popcorn or get coffee. Well, when she gets up, the normal blanket falls off, right? And that's just not good because then she's cold. Or when she's sitting down, she has to reach really far, and when she reaches really far, then her blanket gets in the way, and she has to move it, and she gets cold again. I mean, this is a very simplistic and very dumbed down version of it, but it's marketing nonetheless, right? Well, in the Christian worldview, there is a problem. Actually, in all religions, there is a problem, a need, and even Paul tells us in Romans that we should all see the need, right? That when we want to do good, we don't do good. In fact, we do bad. That there is a dissonance about the types of beings that we are. And honestly, I remember wrestling with that dissonance. Nobody had to necessarily make the logical argument. I didn't know what was going on, but I realized that I was not a good person. And that was all on me. It wasn't something that people pushed on me before believing in Christ. Well, in order for people to get to a solution, they have to believe that there's a problem. You can't get people to a solution if they think that everything is okay. You can't move people to point B. Nobody wants to move if the status quo is good.
Right.
Well, uh, in the second stage, after the problem, after the dissonance is really built up, then you bring them into the solution, right? The solution has to fit the problem, whatever is being discussed as the need, right? That guilt or shame in terms of Christianity, or the need for the perfect sacrifice. Well, you're not perfect, so you can't make that sacrifice. Well, Christ is the perfect sacrifice. Christ fulfilled the law. He's above the law, right? Um, and he actually took that on himself as opposed to us taking that on himself. And even death, which we will all face, he has defeated. Okay. Um, Man, sounds like a good solution in relation to guilt, shame, and worrying about whether or not an eternal figure is going to judge me, or that I didn't get it right because I don't believe in anything. Okay. Even though I believe morally that there are good, there is such a thing as good and evil. And once you get them to that solution, that's not just where it stops. You also have to build in some visualization, right? And the visualization is this hypothetical about the future. It involves the imagination, right? You need to help them see how life could change for the positive if they actually believe and are persuaded by the solution. So if you believe in Christ, then what's going to be different? No, it doesn't mean that you'll never sin again, but it does mean that you have someone that you can go to that will forgive you of your sins. No, it doesn't mean that you only gain eternal life, but in fact that you're becoming more like Christ on a daily basis, that he gives you his spirit, right? The third person of the Trinity. And literally that you are adopted and a co-heir with Christ, right? That your life can be different. And there are some people in situations that they get the hopelessness that honestly you don't even have to spin it big on the need, right? People thinking about suicide ideation, thinking about anxiety, they're overloaded with work, they don't have enough money, right? They've just messed up morally. And to know that there is a God that literally was willing to face death and because he wanted to know us and to bring us to be where he is one day. That's a great solution. And so the visualization helps us see that. And it's very important that we are able to see that, because then we are more likely to act on it. And then the final thing, so you have need, solution, visualization, and then the final thing is the specific call to action. Don't be broad. Tell them one specific thing, right? One specific thing. So if you're preaching and you had an altar call, you would say believe, right? Believe. Uh, if you were trying to get someone to sign something, right? Just sign your name, right? And you want to make it easy for them to do, because if you tell them something broad, like go change the world, guess what?
Yeah.
Nobody can do that, right?
Right.
Go defeat sin and Satan all on your own. That's not going to
Right.
happen. This is the problem with environmentalism and its rhetoric, because
Ah.
there really isn't a solution. Uh, they pretty much put the need in all three of those quadrants, and then give us a visualization, and then it feels like we can't do anything. There is this another term, very briefly, efficacy, self-efficacy. That a lot of the reasons why people don't stop smoking or drinking or doing a whole host of things is because they don't believe that they can do it. So if you can help someone see that they can do it, right, then that is very persuasive. And the problem with a lot of rhetoric today is just like death and destruction, death and destruction, death and destruction. Don't drink from a plastic straw, right? And that doesn't solve anything. Um, and so, uh, so again, the problem, solution, visualization, and then a specific call to action. And again, it's just like, if you agree with this argument that I'm making, for example, about Big Bang Theory, how about you can I ask you to say whether or not you think it is now more plausible from this discussion to believe that the universe started, right, or that it's still eternal? That's doable. as opposed to trying to put the weight of the world on someone's shoulders.
Yeah, and that's you went through a lot of interesting topics here. You talked about even something that really connects back to the idea of mythos, right? You're trying to show this person's mythos is bad, your mythos is good. Here's why mine provides a solution.
Mm,
You talked about um, even just this idea of self-efficacy and small steps, right? Asking people to make small, measurable steps toward improvement, not some very broad, massive idea that they don't know where to begin. They're not, it's
mhm,
going to discourage them. I don't have the power to do that. I'm not the president of the United States. I'm not
mm.
whatever, right?
Just go
Um,
read the whole Bible. Even that
or-
feels overwhelming, right? Just start with
right.
the first chapter in John, right? Just start with the
Exactly.
first chapter in John.
Yeah, exactly. And um, I think of the idea you said this is used highly in advertising.
Mhm,
It reminds me of one of my favorite movies. It's a very niche, interested movie, but it's called UHF. I don't know if you've heard of it,
I
but
don't think
there
so.
is a scene where it's about like a TV station, and there's a point where they interrupt with a TV commercial called Spatula City. And you talk about the need. You need to give someone a need. Well, the whole commercial is funny because obviously, who needs like 10,000 spatulas that they sell only at this store? Oh, honey, where's the spatula? Okay, kids, let's get in the car. And they go off to Spatula City to find their spatulas. But it's exactly right. You need to identify an actual need, not something dumb like that, but
Mm,
certainly something that they are going to connect to and say, yeah, wow, what what do I need to fix this? And it reminds me of something. I think I heard this from Dr. J. Smith, who does a lot of Muslim apologetics, apologetics to them. But he talks about, I don't want to just erode the faith of a Muslim. And he uses an analogy, kind of they're kind of tied to the mast of a sinking boat, right?
mm.
If I get them off of that and that's all I do, they're just treading water.
Right.
I need to throw them the life preserver. And oftentimes people won't even get into the water at all because they're like, well, I better be on a boat even if it's sinking
Mhm,
rather than nothing at all, right? And so there's a dual aspect to it. It's not merely something like uh, showing someone that their boat is sinking or their rope is about to snap. You have to also at the same time show them your solution. Show them,
mhm,
here's why this is the actual help that you're looking for here.
mm.
So, yeah. Why don't we move on then to the final concept, which you've kind of touched on. If there's not a whole
Mhm.
lot left, that's totally fine. But you mentioned uh, analyzing an audience and adapting arguments. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think you're right in that we've indirectly touched on it, but it's just again knowing your audience, right? Marketing, they would tell you you got to study demographics, you got to know the differences. Right now we're in election season. They're looking at polling of what values are different to each particular demographic. You can look at age differences. For example, my dad's a boomer. I barely skipped Gen X. I'm a millennial. Um, and then you have the younger generation, and just the understanding that you're not going to talk about the same topic in the same way with even all of those different people. Okay. uh, and so I forget his name, but there is a, I can get you some of these sources, but there's a book on persuasion from a Christian standpoint, but he kind of gets at, for example, why, and even asking you and your audience when you're speaking to someone, why do you put your apologetic arguments, why do you say it in English? Or my pastor on Sunday, why did he preach in English as opposed to a different language?
Hmm.
Why didn't he
Well,
choose a different language?
yeah.
Well, some people may be that they're not bilingual, right? I'm monolingual, right? And as a student has told me, it is a curable disease. But there's an important reason, and that is because you know your audience. you know that they're all going to be approached in that language, right? And in fact, if you knew that they weren't going to be approached in that language, then you would make accommodations. For example, we have what is it, ESL in our church. But for example,
Interpreters and stuff like that,
yeah,
and
yeah,
sign language. Yeah.
yeah, sign language, and um, but then some churches, for example, if there's a heavy Spanish-speaking population of the church, then they'll have a second service spoken in Spanish. Okay, why do we do that? Because we are accommodating our audience, okay? That we are adapting to our audience. Now, adapting to our audience, what some Christians would say, the same thing they would say about rhetoric, that that is manipulating, right? That is the danger is that your message changes, you change the message to fit the audience. Now that can happen, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about adapting to the audience so that they can believe in the capital T truth, as opposed to adapting our message so that they agree with you politically on something, right? Or ideologically. Why does Paul go from Paul to, or from Saul to Paul in the New Testament? A
Hmm.
lot of people's response would be that God changed his name.
Right.
There's no passage in the New Testament where God changes the name of Saul to Paul. So then
Ah,
what is the reason as to why he changes his name?
he needs a new identity, perhaps?
Well, again, that's an Old Testament ritual, and even in some religions today, that's still the case. But when he goes to speaking to a multi-ethnic population as opposed to primarily Jews,
Right.
Saul is his Greek name.
Right, exactly.
Right. So whenever I've done work overseas, and people could not properly say my name right, then however they said my name, I would do my best to accommodate them and share in that. Right. That's identification, trying to grow closer. So already, Paul changes. He relates to his Gentile audiences through Saul. Right. Um, I'm sorry, Saul to Paul. Paulos is
Right.
the Gentile. Right, um,
Mhm.
because he's trying to adapt to them. Ben Witherington has a really good primer on this called New Testament Rhetoric. It's probably one of the better works that's been done on classical views of rhetoric in the New Testament. He argues that Paul, growing up in Tarshish, would have it would have been a highly educated area. He would have gone to university and training for rabbinic stuff. He would have actually been uh, put in context where he would have learned some rhetorical principles, because again that was a primary aspect of university at that time. But notice also the different speeches, and Ben Witherington makes this argument throughout the book of Acts that Paul gives about his testimony, and Ben Witherington calls them speeches, not sermons. They're all actually identical to the Roman formula of speeches. How do you start, right? How do you the greeting, the hook, if you will, and then kind of the symmetrical ending. Uh, but notice how the speech is different and the details are different each time. Why? Because the audience is different each time. And so he makes this case that we need to understand that audience adaptation, uh, it can be used for good, right? We need to know who we are speaking to, and that in order to truly identify, as Kenneth Burke said earlier, we need to speak the language of our audience. We need to know them, right? So the whole hermeneutical process of Scripture to get to proper exegesis and then proper preaching, you have also to kind of interpret the context of your audience. Like, when I'm preaching this passage to a primarily 65 and older audience, maybe I shouldn't be using hashtags and everything else the joke goes, right? Or even as a youth pastor, whenever I would speak on a Wednesday night services were vastly different than Sunday morning services. Why? Because the makeup of the audience was very different. And these are good reasons that we adapt. And so again, this is just kind of a broader principle in relation to everything that we talked about. It's you are not the most important thing. The listener is in fact the most important person in this conversation, and whether or not you're paying attention to where they are as opposed to where you are, and also not just trying to win, but trying to adapt to them so that they can believe. And that's what Paul did, whether he's being called Paul or Saul. Um, he adapted and he became all things to all people. Why? So that he might win some.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, that wraps us up
Mhm.
about one last thing though. You did you have any more comments on memes? Because I know we didn't return to
Oh,
that, but people laugh at it. They do.
mhm,
They think, "Oh, memes, what is that?" But I have found that memes are some of the most incredibly persuasive
mm,
things out there. I mean, it's so short, it's so simple, it's so
mhm.
snappy. It obviously makes people laugh usually, and it's I don't know. I mean, I think it's a great way to get people on board with something. I mean, we see that even with advertising and products. There was a meme that went viral a few years ago, the Sprite cranberry meme. No one would have bought that product, in excess. But once, Sprite cranberry, oh my gosh, it went viral. Some people even speculate that companies try to make memes go viral about their products so that people will start buying them. Oh my gosh, we got to do it for a challenge. We got to do it for a thing. I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts on that? It's sort of a
Again,
weird.
that's not my primary area, but it is interesting, and there's a lot of work being done. Just know in terms of communication and rhetoric in relation to visual media, it's kind of sad, but also interesting that memes are kind of one of the still shared areas of culture that we have as a society, and even maybe even globally. Like we're so quick to notice our differences and what we don't hold in common, but when a meme pops up, man, we can we can at least a subsection of the population can laugh hysterically at it. A lot of memes are used prophetically, which is to point out the irony of the situation, um, which irony and humor are all uses of that we find in the Old Testament prophets of making jokes or light of something in order to point to truth. So I think there's something to be said about that. Babylon B has done a few good ones in the past. Um, again, that's not really my area, but I am as a rhetorical critic. Every time I see one that is really well done and I like the meaning of it, I'm just like trying to think about how this works. And there's plenty of stuff that has been done on the rhetorical uses of the meme, right? I had a friend years ago did one of when Putin on the Ritz, where you had Vladimir Putin riding the Ritz crackers. I don't remember the overall gist of that. He was in Ukraine for some time, so it was more in his context, but it was hilarious. But it is something that we buy into, and there's a reason that a lot of them go viral. Um, and so maybe we should start thinking about how we might be able to speak small truths through memes, not in a you know, maybe in a hilarious way, but again, keeping in mind identification and alienation.
Awesome stuff. Anything we're not closing out quite yet, but anything you want to leave us with, some more resources, for example, on what people can look into if they are getting excited about this?
Yeah, there's a whole host of different things. I would point you. Let me first point you to just a great network to be a part of, and you don't have to be someone in the academy studying communication to be a part, but they have a number of virtual workshops this summer. Tomorrow, in fact, you have Steve Beebe of Texas A&M, who has done a whole host of research on the communication of C.S. Lewis. He's actually got a book called Professor C.S. Lewis Professor of Communication that he's doing a workshop on virtually tomorrow. But this is theCCSN.com, theCCSN.com, and that is the Christianity and Communication Studies Network. Just some good people there. I write a column on Augustine and homiletics. I've been going through his own Christian doctrine after he converted, and how he is pretty much making the case for rhetoric to to future ministers and how they should study it in order to, speak to the whole person as opposed to not being trained in any form of oratory. Um, so that's again is the Christianity and Communication Studies Network. Ben Witherington has done great work in the classical understanding of rhetoric. I'm more modern, but I love, because I did biblical studies in seminary. You can buy his New Testament rhetoric. It's a primer, but it gives a lot of the same cases that I made for Saul and Paul. For example, there's a reason that Paul begins all of his letters with grace and peace. Peace was a primary way for Jews to begin letters with shalom. Grace was a primary way for Gentiles to begin. Well, he sends both grace and peace to his audience, to the Christian churches. And then he also does a really marvelous analysis of Philemon and the rhetoric that's at work in that story, as Paul is sending Onesimus the slave back um, to Philemon. Tim Muehlhoff and Rick Langer. Tim Muehlhoff and Rick Langer, both of Biola University, they have written two works, Winsome Conviction and Winsome Persuasion. Both are good books. One is about talking to people who are non-believers, and the other one, Winsome Conviction, is about discourse inside the church and how we can disagree on different things. A whole host of different things, but once you get connected to the CCSN, you will find many of these. And if I could give a plug for a virtual workshop that I get to be a part of, it is June 26th. It's called Pastor, Pew, and Public. And this is actually with Tim Muehlhoff, Rick Langer of Biola University, and Dan Darling of Southwestern Theological Seminary. We're primarily talking about truth in an age in which truth is rejected, and how we can speak to congregations as well as to non-believers outside about truth. Right? It's kind of that same question that Jesus gives to Pontius Pilate in relation to truth. That's June 26th. You can find all that information on theCCSN.com. And I'm sure, Woom, I will leave my email if anyone wants to contact me. But I could go on. I have different research. If someone's interested in some rhetorical analysis of John Piper, I have that published online, of Desiring God. Vodi Bakum did a rhetorical analysis of a sermon that he gave on what he called ethnic Gnosticism. This is kind of the discussion of critical race theory. And I have a paper coming out soon on the rhetorical chemotherapy of Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, which is about the abortion debate. That's going to be probably in a month or two. And then my dissertation was on C.S. Lewis, John Piper, and the American Humanist Association. So I'm kind of all over the board because, again, I love looking at religious communication, especially in the Christian context, both to tell us how we could do better and to also hold us accountable when we get to that point of coercion, manipulation, or speaking about scripture or truth in a way that is actually not true.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, like you said, you're all over the board. I will follow up with you, and I'll put some links in the description for people afterward when this is posted. So thanks so much for joining us, Professor Knight. This has been so awesome. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but wow, you are definitely a professional teacher of this subject. No doubt about that. And
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's just been a pleasure, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, sir. Thank y'all.
Bye-bye. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of your views. And I just wanted to let you know, you can comment something that you learned today down in the description, or not the description, but in the comment section below. And if you found this content valuable, please consider subscribing, because this is the kind of stuff that I want to bring you on my channel. This is something that I'm covering that I don't see any other apologetics channels talking about, which is how do we not just make arguments one way or the other, but actually persuade. So definitely subscribe if that interests you, and I'll see you later. Do not miss out. See ya. God bless.